Let's turn to Matthew chapter 16. Last time we really had to break off in the middle of a verse, which is fairly unusual, although it's not too uncommon that we fail to take the passage that we're hoping to cover. It's very uncommon that we have to stop in the middle of a verse for lack of time. Of course, with most verses, it's possible for us to run maybe a few minutes overtime in order to make sure we finish the verse, but the problem is the verses in question are so packed with things worthy of comment that, having talked about the first part of the verse at some length, and I feel like I couldn't have done a shorter treatment of it, I realized that the next portion of the verse also requires a lengthy treatment, much more lengthy than I could have really justified running the class overtime last time. So we're in Matthew 16:18. What I'd like to do, however, is read the passage beginning with verse 13 so that we can remember what we covered last time. Matthew 16:13 says, "When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, 'Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?' So they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Simon Peter answered and said, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' Jesus answered and said to him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.' Then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ." All right. Now, we read last time and commented up through half of verse 18, where he said, "And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." That's where we left off, because it was necessary for us to discuss the possible meanings of this statement, "Upon this rock I will build my church." I pointed out that the long-standing tradition of the Roman Catholics is that the rock upon which the church is built is a reference to Peter himself. And they would point out in favor of this that in the early chapters of the book of Acts, Peter is very clearly the spokesman for the disciples and generally the most visible leader of the apostles. And therefore this is a reflection of his special status that Jesus conferred upon him at this time at Caesarea Philippi, because Peter was able to first identify Jesus with conviction, even at this time of low popularity of Jesus, as the Messiah and as the Son of God. Jesus said that this had been revealed to Peter by the Spirit. Now, of course, there's nothing in the passage that suggests that Peter was seeing something more than the other apostles were, that somehow he caught this and yet the Father had not revealed this to the other apostles. The fact that he is the spokesman for the rest probably doesn't mean that he's ahead of the rest in understanding, but that he's just quicker to speak than the rest, and he speaks knowing full well what their conviction is as a group. I pointed out that at the end of chapter 6 of John, Jesus said to the 12, "Will you also go away?" And Peter again spoke up to them and said, "Well, Lord, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of everlasting life," suggesting that he was speaking for the rest of them. We are going nowhere. We recognize who you are. And therefore Peter, though he speaks out more than the rest, doesn't necessarily have more insight than the rest. He speaks as their spokesman. And that appears to be true in the book of Acts as well. Peter's visible leadership in the book of Acts may be nothing more than a reflection of his temperament, which is visible even in the days of his presence with Jesus. I mean, Peter is the one who speaks out the most readily, most self-confident, most quick to speak. And the fact that he continues to be that way in the book of Acts is no shift in anything that we've seen previous to this in the Gospels. He's also the quickest to speak out for the rest. In any case, I'm not wishing to deny that Peter had a central place of authority among the apostles, or that they deferred to him in some respect, or looked to him to speak for the group. It's clear that those early chapters of Acts do focus on Peter's ministry a great deal, although, of course, by the time you come to Acts chapter 15 and the Jerusalem Council, Peter's authority is not special. He is appealed to by James, but it's quite clear that James is the one who makes the final decision about whether circumcision and Jewish law is to be imposed on Gentile Christians or not. He does cite Peter's testimony along with that of others. Peter seems to be one of the many witnesses in the court, as it were, in the hearings, but James is the one who comes to the conclusion. And sets the conditions for acceptance of the Gentiles. Which means that Peter is certainly not given any recognition as the head of the church or the chief leader of the apostles in that particular story in the book of Acts. And at other times we see, of course, Paul in Galatians 2 rebuking Peter, and Peter apparently deferring to Paul in that. And other things that would suggest that though Peter was a very outspoken leader in the church, he may not have been recognized as, generally speaking, the God-anointed leader of the group. Anyway, we don't need to conjecture about that because I have no objection to suggesting that Peter was a leader of the apostles. He certainly is visible in the early chapters of Acts, but the question is whether he was visible in the way he was because of this special statement Jesus made. Was this a special commissioning of Peter to be the leader of the church? If there ever was such a commission of Peter, I think we'd find it more likely in the passage in John 21 rather than here. In John 21, when Jesus had risen from the dead and met the disciples by the Sea of Galilee, 3 times he said to Peter, "Do you love me?" Remember, he said, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" And Peter said, "Yes." And Jesus said, "Well, feed my lambs," or "feed my sheep." And 3 times he asked the question and gave the same commission, "Feed my sheep," or "feed my lambs." And the very statement, "feed my sheep" or "my lambs," could be construed as Jesus making Peter the shepherd, or appointing Peter as the leader of the church. I mean, the church is God's sheep, and Peter would be therefore commissioned to be their shepherd and their leader. However, the same passage could as easily be interpreted to apply, to simply say that Jesus was restoring Peter to the position of apostleship, which he had no doubt, at least in the minds of some, forfeited by his denial of Christ 3 times at the time of Jesus' trials. Jesus had said, "He that denies me before men, I'll deny before my Father which is in heaven." And when Peter 3 times denied Christ, he certainly would have brought some question upon his continued usefulness or even continued salvation. And it is often thought that the reason Jesus asked Peter this question and said what he did 3 times is to correspond with the 3 times that Peter denied him, and to basically say, "I restore you to your former position." But what was that position? Was that a position above the other apostles, or was that simply a position among the other apostles? When he says, "Peter, feed my sheep," is it possible that it was understood that the other apostles already had that duty, and Peter was now being restored to his original position as one of them? He also was now being restored to leadership, but not necessarily leadership over the other apostles, but leadership of the church along with the other apostles. So even though Peter is sometimes spoken to especially, it may not be because of Peter's special privilege that Jesus was given, but because Peter had special needs or was especially outspoken or made mistakes more often and had to be specially restored. Anyway, without trying to reflect negatively on Peter at all, I just don't think that there's much in this passage to justify the Roman Catholic contention that Peter and his successors as bishops of Rome are somehow today the heads of all the churches and the shepherds of the entire church. What I suggested as a more likely thing, and it's a very common Protestant thing to say, is that the rock upon which the church is built is Christ. Now, that would not be the most obvious meaning of the passage as we read it in Matthew, and it would require possibly that we suggest that Jesus made a gesture toward himself when he said, "Upon this rock," meaning himself, "I will build my church." There are those, as I pointed out, I'm simply reviewing because it's a long time ago we had this class, there are those who would say, well, the difference in the Greek words, Petros and Petra, would suggest that Peter is not the rock upon which it's built, but a bigger rock than Peter is the rock upon which the church is built, and that would have to be Jesus. Well, I would come to the same conclusion, but not by way of the same arguments. I would say that in looking at what Paul and later Peter himself in his epistles say, that the standard understanding of both these writers in the New Testament is that the church is built upon Christ. Paul said, "No other foundation can anyone lay but not that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ." He doesn't mention Peter even as being a secondary foundation after Jesus. He just mentions Jesus as the only foundation of the church. It's true he does in Ephesians 4 say that the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, which doesn't mean that now Jesus has been replaced by the apostles and prophets, but rather it probably means that the foundation laid by the apostles and prophets, they were the builders. Paul himself said, "I, as a wise master builder, have laid the foundation of the church in Corinth." No doubt other apostles and prophets were seen as the foundation layers of the church. Therefore, Jesus, as the foundation of the church, was the foundation of the apostles and prophets, meaning that foundation which was laid by them, by their preaching and by their ministries. They laid this foundation. It was theirs. but Christ again is the foundation. Most telling of all is the fact that Peter himself in 1 Peter chapter 2 talks about stones and rocks and even with reference to the foundation of the church. A perfect opportunity for him to make some allusion to his own special status in this case. And he makes no such reference. Now, I mean, if Peter had said nothing about stones at all, we might just say, well, you know, in the small range of the books that he wrote, the few that he wrote, it's not surprising he didn't mention everything, and that he might not have mentioned his priority over the church. Might not be too surprising, if not for the fact that he specifically in 1 Peter 2 does address the question of what is the foundation of the church. He speaks about Jesus as a living stone. He talks about us, Christians, as living stones also, built upon Christ, built up into a spiritual house. He quotes from Isaiah about how God will lay in Zion, that is in the church, for a foundation, a stone, and Peter identifies that stone as Christ. And, you know, in all that discussion, there's not a hint that Peter thought that he was different than other Christians in terms of stoniness or in terms of his rock or foundational calling or whatever. So I am of the impression that Peter is simply an apostle, not the leader of the apostles, and I do have a very high view of apostolic authority. But I don't know that Jesus is making a reference to that authority here when he says, upon this rock I'll build my church. Since both Paul and Peter, who are the only guys who ever spoke about the question in the later epistles, they identified Jesus as that rock upon which the church is built. In fact, Jesus himself seems to have done so earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, when he said, everyone who hears these words of mine and does them is like a wise man who builds his house on a rock. And a man who hears these words of mine and does not do them is like a foolish man who builds his house on sand. Well, a rock is the foundation of the house that continues. Sand is the foundation or the non-foundation of the house that doesn't continue. And the difference between the house on the rock and the house on the sand is that the one that is on the rock is the one that's built on the authority of Christ. That is the acceptance of his commands and the following of them. He that hears these commands of mine, Jesus said, and does them is like the man who builds his house on a rock. He is talking about the foundation of a Christian life being, of course, obedience to Jesus Christ, which suggests acceptance of his lordship and his authority. So, again, there's nothing in the Bible elsewhere outside this passage that would suggest Peter as having a special role in this respect, but there's much in the teaching of Jesus, Paul, and even Peter himself later to suggest that Christ is the foundation. So, whether Jesus made some kind of a gesture or felt that his words should simply be understood without it, when he says, on this rock I'll build my church, certainly the previous statements of Jesus and the later statements of the apostles would indicate that they understood this means Jesus is the rock upon which the church is built. And he says, after saying that, in Matthew 16:18, and we haven't commented on this yet, the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And then he commanded his disciples they shouldn't tell anyone that he was the Christ. Now these words that he spoke to Peter are full of mystery. He continues to, when he says of the church, the gates of Hades will not prevail against, what is the meaning of that? Well, there's three possible meanings that have occurred to people at one time or another. Which is correct is not entirely clear, but there's certainly one of the three doesn't strike me as being as strong as the other two possibilities. And that is the first one that I ever understood when I was a kid and reading passages like this. This passage was well familiar to me, but its meaning was not. When it said that the gates of hell or gates of Hades would not prevail against the church. The word Hades is frequently called hell. In fact, in the King James, it is translated as hell. And to say the gates of hell in the King James would not prevail against the church, I understood to mean that the church would survive. The church would survive despite the fierce attacks of hostile parties. The gates of hell I took to be the forces of darkness, the powers of the demonic realm, and so forth. And to say that they would not prevail against the church suggested to my mind for many years that the church, when attacked by hostile powers, would stand up. It was sort of a fortress mentality I had, that the church was a fortress, being battered on every side by enemies, but those battering rams of the enemies would not prevail against the church, and the church would survive throughout history until the end. Now, this may be a very true picture of things, but it's not a very true treatment of the passage that we're looking at. I'm sure that seen as a fortress, the church is in fact a fortress that will stand against all attacks until the Lord comes back. But there's that's hardly likely to be the meaning of this passage. Because if that were what Jesus was trying to convey, he should have said something like, and the battering rams of hell will not prevail against the church, or the onslaught of the armies of hell will not prevail against, or something like that. But he said the gates of hell, the gates of Hades. And therefore, and I didn't see this until I was actually an adult and had read this many, many times until dawn. I was thinking, wow, gates of hell, what's that mean? People don't attack cities by using gates. They try to get through the gates, but the gates are not weapons of aggression. The gates are weapons of defense. And to speak of the gates of Hades seems to suggest Hades not on the offensive, but on the defensive. That the gates would not prevail suggested, at this later point in my life, that the church is on the offensive. The church is the one battering at the walls of the kingdom of darkness and at the gates of the kingdom of darkness, and those gates were going to break open. There are a number of times in the Bible that we read of, a city under siege, and finally the enemy gets in by breaking through the gate, or by having insiders who open the gate for him, or some other means. Of course, the gate is the weakest point of the wall. And to maintain the gates secure is one of the most important things to keep a city secure from attacks. But if the gates are broken through, if the gates do not stand against the oppressor, then the city is likely to be taken. And to say the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church suggests that the church is the one doing the battering. The church is the one on the offensive, making an attack on the realm of Hades. And that attack will be successful, and nothing will be able to stand against it. Now, I want to say this. If that is the meaning of it, I believe that is certainly doctrinally correct. It is. I certainly have nothing against that viewpoint. It seems to be correct in terms of its correspondence with reality. Wherever the church has gone, the gates of Hades have had to open and release prisoners, and the church has been established wherever missionaries have gone. And though Satan and the powers of darkness often put up initial resistance and even continuing resistance, the church wins. The church gets established and grows. And so we could understand the meaning of the statement in those terms. There is one other possible meaning of it that's entirely different than either of the other two. You see, the two meanings I've suggested already both cast the statement in the scenario of spiritual warfare. In the one case, it was seen the church as being attacked, but surviving. The other case was seen the church as making the attack, and their enemy not surviving. But is there a possibility that there's no attack and no spiritual warfare involved at all in this passage? I don't know. Let me suggest at least what one commentator I read years ago suggested, that it seems not altogether impossible. The gates of Hades might have nothing to do with the powers of darkness per se, and the reference to them not prevailing might have little or nothing to do with what we typically call spiritual warfare. Hades could be representative, could just be a way of speaking of the place of the dead, even almost synonymous with the grave. And the picture may be that while it is true that all persons, Christian or non, do die and do go to the grave or to Hades, and the gates close over them, as it were, and they're locked into the realm of death, that Jesus, by the power of his resurrection, will bring his church out of the grave. He'll raise them up in the last day, and the gates of Hades will not be able to keep them in. That they are locked up, as it were, their bodies locked up, subject to decay in the grave or in the place of the dead, and yet at the resurrection, those gates will be burst open, even as the tomb of Jesus and the stone could not contain him, and that stone that was sealed over the opening to the tomb could not prevail against his purpose of walking out. So also that the church will not be prevailed against by death or by Hades or by the grave or whatever. Oh, death, where's your sting? Oh, grave, where's your victory? Paul says in one of his passages about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. And in Revelation 20, it says death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Death and Hades linked together. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're identical, and it doesn't mean that Hades, in this particular statement of Jesus, means the grave necessarily. It is questionable, and that's all I can leave it at. He may be saying that while Hades claims all persons, yet his church will escape the jaws of death, will escape the gates of Hades, as it were, when he resurrects them from the dead, and they will have eternal life. They will not be forever subject and imprisoned in the grave. Now, that, to tell you the truth, although that would be doctrinally correct also, it is not at all as sensational as either of the other two suggestions, and And it's almost a disappointment to those of us who revel in images of militant church spiritual warfare and so forth. I mean, because it kind of removes one of our favorite scriptures from the realm of that discussion. But all I can say is I don't know which meaning is most likely to be correct. I will say this, I've always emotionally been drawn to, as I said, the second possibility, that is the church that is seen as battering the gates of Hades, and Hades loses. The gates don't stand up, the gates don't prevail against the church. And there's every reason to believe that is a good interpretation. But it is not the only possible interpretation, and therefore we have to be a little bit, we need to pray about it before we get dogmatic about what its meaning is. After all, Hades, under this interpretation, would have to be recognized as a symbol of the realm of darkness or of the kingdom of darkness. If we say the gates of Hades means the powers of Satan and so forth, well, then we have to find some way to make that identification. Hades in the Bible is more commonly the place of the dead, not the place of the demons or the devil. The devil is sometimes said to be in the abyss, the abusos, but Hades, as far as I know, is not the term that is used. In fact, even though Hades is the common term that is translated hell most often in the King James Version, the one place in the Bible that speaks of demons being in hell uses a different Greek word. In 2 Peter chapter 2, where it says that the angels that left their first estate are confined in hell, it says in the King James Version, but the Greek word is not Hades, it's Tartarus. The only occurrence of that Greek word in the entire Bible is the place where the demons are confined. So, in a place where Hades could have been used to be identified with the realm of the demons or something, the Greek text doesn't use Hades there. So, it's very hard to know for sure what justification we could have for identifying Hades as a symbol of the demonic realm or the power of Satan or whatever. With the possible exception that we would have to say, in Hebrews chapter 2, it says that he that had the power of death is the devil. Hebrews 2 and verse 14 says that Jesus through death destroyed him that had the power of death, that is the devil. So certainly the power of death would also be related to the power of Hades, and that might be enough to make the link. But, I mean, if you just go through the Bible and look at all the times where Hades is used, it much more often is associated with the physically dead persons who died, rather than, I don't know of any case where it's specifically linked to the demonic realm. And that is a link we would have to make if we're going to interpret this as some kind of reference to a warfare between the powers of darkness and the powers of God. And it is more common for Hades to refer to the state of the dead. And if Jesus said the gates of Hades will not prevail against my people, my church, that may be, there may be stronger arguments in that particular association for it being a reference to the resurrection. I can't say for sure, so I just give you this as something to chew on for the rest of your life and to die without certainty about, probably. But you will have certainty when you die that the gates of Hades won't prevail against you, at least. Now, verse 19, he continues speaking to Peter, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, the first question is, of course, what are the keys to the kingdom of heaven? And secondly, to whom are they given? And thirdly, what do they have to do with binding and loosing? And fourthly, what is being bound and what is being loosed? Now, if you didn't write all those things down, take courage, we're going to go through them one by one. First of all, what is the meaning of the expression keys to the kingdom of heaven? The fact is that the expression is not found elsewhere in the Bible. This is the only place it talks about the keys of the kingdom. Therefore, we don't have a plethora of other verses that we could bring in to compare the usage and find out, what is the common denominator that's always used in these verses and what is the common meaning in all these cases. We only have one case. And whenever you have an expression found only once in the Bible, it raises a tremendous challenge in being able to identify exactly what it means, unless the statement, the phrase is so clear that there's no question. That is not the case here. What are the keys of the kingdom? One would presume that the keys, the imagery of keys is used to suggest unlocking. And locking. That would seem to be a fair inference. Now, does that have any relevance to the gates of Hades? Now, the gates of Hades presumably would have locks on them. Is there any connection here between the keys of the kingdom and the gates of Hades? Well, it's tempting to find something, but it's not at all obvious, because it would seem like you need the keys to Hades to open the gates of Hades, not the keys to the kingdom. It's not the gates of the kingdom of heaven that are not to prevail, and therefore the keys are there to open them. But you've got on the one hand Hades with gates, and the kingdom with keys. And it's hard to know whether there's supposed to be an actual flow of thought from one thought to the next as if one's consequent upon the other. I would point out that Jesus is said in the book of Revelation to have the keys of death and Hades. He says that in, I believe, Revelation chapter 1. Perhaps would have been wise for me to find time to look that up. Just so I can make sure that I can point it out to you. Maybe it's not chapter 1. I thought it was. Yeah, it is. It is. No. Oh, here we go. It's Revelation 1:18. Jesus says, "I am he who lives and was dead, and behold, I'm alive forevermore. Amen. And I have the keys of Hades and death." Now, this could hardly be identified as the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Hades and death and the kingdom of heaven are not, the same thing. But it's interesting that if Jesus has the keys to Hades and death, it suggests that he can open their gates or open their doors, that is, their prison doors, and release people from the grave, and from Hades and death. And this may be helpful in understanding what the gates of hell refers to. Since Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, it may be because Jesus has the keys. He can open them and release those who are imprisoned in it. It seems at least a sensible suggestion, if not the only one possible. Anyway, what I'm saying is that there are keys mentioned elsewhere, but not specifically keys to the kingdom. And so what does it mean that there are keys of the kingdom? Now, I'll tell you, again, the Roman Catholics make great use of this entire section here, especially verses 18 and 19. And their suggestion is that these keys were given specifically to Peter and to no one else. Because Peter made Jesus so happy on this occasion by giving the right answer to the quiz that Jesus gave him a privilege for all time that would be unparalleled by any, and that included having the keys to the kingdom of God. This would be the ability to admit somebody into heaven or not into heaven, and this is no doubt where the imagery, entirely traditional, arose from, where we talk about Peter at the pearly gates. All the jokes about people going to heaven and discovering something to be different than they hoped. It always involves the fact that they died and they met St. Peter at the pearly gates, with the keys. All of this comes, no doubt, from the idea that Peter is the only person to whom these keys are given, and that the keys to the kingdom apparently are the key to heaven. That he can let people into heaven or not. And he's got that privilege. Now, let me turn your attention over to Isaiah 22, because there we have what Roman Catholics usually point to as the sort of the background for this statement. Isaiah 22. Now, I'm not here just to bash on Catholics. I'm just saying this passage we're dealing with is very strongly applied to establish Catholic dogma, and without knowing what that argument is or whether there are arguments against it, we would be left unsure whether the Catholics are right about this or not. I believe they're not. And so in verse 15 of Isaiah 22 it says, "Thus says the Lord God of hosts, go proceed to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the house, and say, what have you here? And whom have you here that you have hewn a sepulchre here, as he who hews himself a sepulchre on high, who carves a tomb for himself in a rock? Indeed, the Lord will throw you away violently, O mighty man, and will surely seize you. He will surely turn violently and toss you like a ball into a large country. There you shall die, and there your glorious chariot shall be the shame of your master's house. So I will drive you out of your office, and from your position he will pull you down." Now, before I read further, and it's necessary that we do so, we are not told why this man Shebna has fallen into disfavor. We know very little about him. He is mentioned in the book of Kings. In fact, you may have encountered that passage already, where he and others go out and deal with Rabshakeh in the days of Hezekiah, and that is the time of this prophecy. Shebna was a person who was a steward over the house of the king of Hezekiah, and he plays a bit part in the story of the negotiations with Rabshakeh. But anyway, the prophet indicates that God is upset with this guy, and he's going to toss him, and his arrogance in building a tomb for himself among the kings in the high places is going to bring a shame to him and to his master's house and so forth. But then it says in verse 20, "Then it shall be in that day that I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and I will clothe him with your robe, and strengthen him with your belt, and commit your responsibility into his hand. And he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. Now, that would indicate that this man Eliakim is moving into the exact office that Shebna was being expelled from. Then verse 22 says, and the key of the house of David I will lay on his shoulder. So he shall open and no one shall shut, and he shall shut and no one shall open. I will fasten him as a peg in a sure place, and he will become a glorious throne to his father's house. Whereas Shebna would become a shame to his master's house, Eliakim would be a glorious throne to his father's house. Now, the thing of importance here is, of course, in verse 22. There's a mention of the key of the house of David. Now, we know that the position that Eliakim was given was that position which had been held by Shebna. Shebna, in verse 15, is described as a steward over the house. Okay, this expression, steward over the house, is the exact expression in Hebrew that's used of Joseph when he was over Potiphar's house. So it tells us something about the status and the authority involved. When Joseph was in Potiphar's house, we're told that he was made steward over everything, so much so he was given authority over all the servants, over all the possessions. His master trusted him with so many things that his master was entirely vulnerable to him. And his master didn't even know what he owned except the food that was put on his table at each meal. Everything was entrusted in the hand of Joseph. He was a steward over all the house. That apparently is parallel to the position Shebna held over the house of Hezekiah. And that position is now being given to another man, to Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. And part of that job description, or privilege, is said to have the key of the house of David laid on his shoulder. He will open and no one will shut, he shall shut and no one will open. Now, that this key is of the house of David suggests that it's the key to the palace. The house of David was the Davidic dynasty. And speaking of opening and closing and no one being able to revoke his decision suggests that he was given such authority that he alone could provide access or debar from access persons wishing to come into the house of the king, to come and appear before the king. Shebna and eventually Eliakim had the authority to shut the way to the king's chambers or to open them, and his decision was final. If he opened the way, no one could shut it. If he shut it, no one could open it. He had the key, and apparently he had the only key. Very possibly the king himself may have had a key also, but this was a very trusted role. It made the king somewhat vulnerable. It made everybody else, of course, subject to the whims of the man who had the keys. Now, it is said by the Roman Catholics that when Jesus gave to Peter the keys to the kingdom of God, that follows on this concept of the keys to the house of David. That he opens and no one shuts, he shuts and no one opens. After all, didn't Jesus say to Peter, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you bind in heaven will be loose on earth will be loose in heaven? It sounds kind of similar. And so they say Jesus was giving these very keys to Peter. By the way, they would point out that in this very passage in Isaiah, that there is a reference to Eliakim's father's house, and it says in verse 24, they, meaning the household of Eliakim, will hang on him all the glory of his father's house, and offspring in the issue, all vessels of small quantity, etc., etc. The offspring in the issue will benefit from this man's position, is what's being said here. And they say that shows that there will be a succession. That the keys of the house of David are passed along in succession. And since these were given to Peter, then there was also a succession from Peter to his successors of these keys. Now, anybody who has done any biblical exegesis will notice immediately the extreme strained nature of this kind of argument. There's absolutely no reference to succession of the key of David here. It does mention that Eliakim's offspring and his father's house in general will benefit from the nepotism that goes along with having a son or a father in a government position. But there's no suggestion whatsoever that once Eliakim is dead, one of his sons is going to have these keys. There's not that slightest suggestion. The office is an appointed office. It was not a dynastic royal position that was passed from father to son. At least if it was, there's no indicator in the Bible of this, nor in history. Therefore, that assumption is wrong in itself. But it is necessary for the idea of succession of the keys of the kingdom being passed from Peter to all his successors, the bishops of Rome. Now, let me say this. I am not at all convinced that this passage in Isaiah 22 is intended to shed light on Matthew 16. there is, in fact, a place in the New Testament where Isaiah 22 is made reference to. In other words, the New Testament writers are not ignorant of this passage. They even think it's significant. However, they don't apply it to Peter. The application is made in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 7. Revelation 3:7 says, this is Jesus speaking, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these things says he who is holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, who shuts and no one opens. Now there can be no doubt that this is a quotation from Isaiah 22:22. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt whatsoever. You'll have a cross-reference to Isaiah 22:22 in the margin of your Bible, if you have any margins at all in your Bible. If it does not say that, it's strange. Okay? Now, who then has the key of David? Who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens? Jesus. Jesus does. The position that the Roman Catholics want to give to Simon Peter is claimed in the New Testament only for Jesus himself, and it's directly made by Jesus from his own mouth, that he's the one who has these keys. He's the one who opens and no one shuts. Peter is not the one, nor any of his successors. Therefore, the whole argument from Isaiah 22 in favor of Peter and succession and authority, special place for Peter and that, it falls like a house of cards. But the question then remains, what is the key? What are the keys to the kingdom of heaven? Well, before I answer that, I need to talk about to whom they are given. Who are they given to? Well, in Matthew 16, Jesus says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So, they are given to Peter. He's speaking to Peter. They are given to Peter. The question is, are they given only to Peter? Or is it again, since Peter is speaking up as spokesman for the apostles, that the promise made to Peter is simply that which is conferred on the apostles in general? Well, to decide that, we should look at how the passage goes on. He says, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, I'd like to point out to you that this exact expression is used again by Jesus in Matthew 18, 2 chapters later. Now here Jesus is talking to his apostles as a group. There's not the slightest indicator that Peter alone is the person being addressed. In Matthew 18, verse 18, Jesus says, assuredly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again I say to you, if two of you agree on earth concerning anything they shall ask, it will be done for them by my Father. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Now, these references, 2 of you, or 2 or 3 gathered in my name, is in close proximity with, I give you the power to bind and loose. And here the persons given that power would seem to be all the apostles, and some would even say all Christians. Now, I don't know that we could argue that it's given to all Christians. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. But I think we could at least say that in this passage it's not confined to Peter alone. At the very least, all the apostles are given this same authority that is given to Peter. Now, one thing a Catholic friend of mine who I was debating this point with a few weeks ago pointed out from this passage was that, well, in Matthew 18:18, although it does mention binding and loosing, it doesn't mention the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, only Peter was given the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Binding and loosing might be done by other apostles or bishops or whatever, but only Peter was given the keys. Well, that's arguing from silence. It's not necessary for Jesus to mention the keys to the kingdom every time he talks about the same subject, especially if he's talking about something that is essentially identical with it. In my understanding, and this is for everyone to judge with validity for himself, in Matthew 16:19, the keys of the kingdom are inseparably connected to the binding and loosing. What is binding and loosing, if you don't take it metaphorically, but confining or releasing, chaining or unchaining, putting a person into prison or letting them out of prison, putting them in the shackles or releasing them from the shackles. This is what binding and loosing conveys, this idea. And in all ordinary situations where a person is bound by another, unless it's with a rope, some lock is used, and some key is necessary for the opening of the lock. It would appear to me that the keys that Peter is given are not the keys of access to the kingdom of heaven necessarily, although it may have that meaning. We'll have to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But rather they are keys that are used for binding and loosing. Okay? Now, I'm not sure that the Catholics would disagree with that assumption, but the point is, I think that Matthew 16:19 links the possession of the keys of the kingdom inseparably with the ability to open or close the locks, to bind or to loose. How could one bind or loose if they don't have the keys necessary for the job? Therefore, while it is true that in Matthew 18:18, in the second time that he speaks of binding and loosing to all the apostles, he doesn't in that passage mention the keys. I think it's fair enough to say they are implied. It is implied that if Peter had the keys so that he could bind and loose, then when he gave the other apostles the authority to bind and loose, it was suggesting they too had the keys. In fact, it is my impression that when Jesus speaks to Peter, when Jesus speaks to Peter in the passage in Matthew 16, that he's simply speaking to Peter as an apostle and saying to Peter what is true of all apostles. Peter simply being the most outspoken and the one who's getting the attention in this particular conversation. But Jesus is saying something that pertained to all the apostles. Namely, that they had the keys. That represents the authority to bind something and loose something. Now that brings us to, one of the more perplexing things in the passage, and that what in the heck is being bound and what's being loosed? What does it mean to bind and loose? Once we've gone over all these details with fine-tooth comb, I'll summarize the whole picture so you don't miss the forest and trees. But there's a lot of opinions about this. Of course, one of the opinions most current among charismatics is that this is a promise that we can bind the devil and loose the devil, or demons. In fact, it is often linked in teaching of charismatics and in teaching about spiritual warfare, is linked with Jesus' talk about binding the strong man. He said in another place in Matthew 12 that, unless you bind the strong man, a thief can't break into his house and take his goods. So it implies that plundering the house of the strong man requires first that you bind the strong man. Now, this taken together with the passage before us has been given as a reason for us in prayer or in spiritual warfare, binding demons, binding the devil, or whatever, so that we might plunder his house. While you can probably tell by the way I'm introducing that thought that I don't fully feel comfortable with it, I don't want to discredit it altogether. But let me just say this. When Jesus said what he said about binding the strong man, I don't believe he was giving his disciples instructions that they should bind the strong man, but he was simply saying that his ability to plunder Satan's house proved that he had already done this. He had bound the strong man. He was casting out demons. He was accused of doing it by the power of Beelzebub, the prince of demons. He said, how can this be? He said, no one goes into a strong man's house and plunders his house unless he's first bound the strong man. Well, essentially what he was saying is that by casting out demons, he was not working in cahoots with the devil. He was plundering the devil's house. He is plundering the strong man's house, and clearly that can't be done unless the strong man has himself been rendered incapable of resistance. And Jesus is saying, since I'm doing this, it's clear that the devil has been bound by me, that the devil has been rendered incapable of resisting, or else I couldn't be able to do this. And so Jesus is not giving instructions. He's about what we must do in spiritual warfare. He's basically making an announcement. I have bound Satan. And then, of course, it remains to be asked, well, why then should anyone else have to do it? Jesus did it. Why would we have to bind Satan? Now, there may be an answer to that, but it's a good one. And I'll come to that in a moment. But I want to say that there is nothing in the context of Matthew 16, nor in the context of Matthew 18, where binding and loosing is mentioned. There's nothing to guide us to a consideration of how we are to treat demons here. Okay? There's nothing in the context which suggests demons are in view, or spiritual warfare is necessarily in view, except possibly that the gates of hell will not prevail against it if that's understood to be in the context of spiritual warfare, and that could be. However, the passage in Matthew 18 doesn't seem to be talking about spiritual warfare. It talks, well, what is it talking about in Matthew 18? It's right after verses 15 through 17, which are very well known to us. Those are the passages that people always appeal to when there's a conflict that needs to be resolved. If your brother sins against you, go to him alone. Between you and your brother, try to restore him. If you win him, great. If you don't. Says, In verse 18, assuredly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And then he talks about the authority that exists whenever two or more agree about anything, although the anything doesn't necessarily focus on the issue of spiritual warfare, but actually focuses on church discipline, inclusion or exclusion of persons from the church. Now, perhaps instead of raising all the questions, having brought up the data, I should give you some kind of a tentative answer to what I think the meaning probably is. It should first be pointed out, I think, that binding and loosing was actually a very common expression used by the rabbis. It's most likely that Jesus' disciples would have understood it in its common sense as popularized by the rabbis with whom they were very familiar. The rabbis taught in the synagogues every Sabbath, and no doubt the language of the rabbis was familiar to all Jews. And the rabbis spoke quite often about binding and loosing. And it was a figure of speech that meant to allow or to disallow some particular behavior. To allow or to disallow some particular behavior. For example, where one rabbi was lenient, it might be said that he loosed a certain behavior. That is, he allowed it. But a rabbi who was strict would be said to bind a certain action by disallowing it. If he bound it, he didn't allow it. If he loosed it, he did allow it. And this was, of course, usually relating to ethical or religious practices. Okay. Now, there's a good chance that Jesus' disciples would have understood his comments in that typical rabbinic way of expressing things. And if he did, then it would suggest that the binding and loosing that the apostles were engaged in had to do with allowing or disallowing what would become normative Christian practice. This doesn't mean he was giving the apostles the authority the rabbis had, because Jesus didn't think the rabbis had any authority. But it would mean that he was giving the actual authority to the apostles that the rabbis pretended to have. Rabbis never spoke with authority like Christ did. That's what the great difference between Jesus' teaching was from that of the rabbis, as noted by everyone who heard him. But the rabbis did profess to have some kind of right to be heard. And if Rabbi so-and-so had a high reputation and he bound certain behavior, then there would be certain people who would be, in their conscience, restricted by that declaration. But that rabbi didn't have any actual authority from God, but the apostles actually did. They could determine what would and what would not be acceptable practice in the church. Now, that would fit the latter case, especially in chapter 18, where it says you kick a person out of the church if his behavior doesn't work out. It would be perfectly natural for him to say to the apostles, you guys are the ones who have the rights to determine what's going to be acceptable and what's not going to be acceptable. And what behavior will be tolerated as normative in the church and what behavior will not be tolerated as normative in the church. It would not be the same thing as saying you get to decide who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. It would just be saying you get to decide what the church is going to stand for. What doctrines, what practices, what policies are going to be Christian, are going to have the name Christian. In other words, he's conferring on them the authority to make the declarations and to stand unchallenged by the rank and file of their subordinates in the church. It would not be necessary to take a vote. As long as the apostles had made a decree, the church would say, okay, Jesus gave them the authority to bind. That is, to restrict a certain behavior. Or to loose it. That is, to allow it. To determine what's normative for Christians. Now, that makes perfectly good sense to me. I don't know if it does to others, but it would seem to be saying that Peter and the other apostles particularly had this authority. Now, there's something else to observe here that is commonly overlooked. And that is that the translation of Matthew 16:19 and the like translation of the identical statement in Matthew 18:18, the two places that talk about binding and loosing, the translation that we're looking at right now is not quite perfectly accurate. Actually, most translations that I've seen are not quite perfectly accurate. And I don't say that based on putting myself above the translators, but based on putting some scholars against other scholars. Basically, one can affirm what I'm about to say simply by looking up in a Greek-English interlinear New Testament, or by a great number of commentaries that bring this out, or in some cases, a translation. I think the New American Standard Version renders this somewhat correctly, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the NIV doesn't, but I think the NIV puts it in a footnote. It renders it correctly in a footnote, if I'm not mistaken. Okay? In fact, I'm not even sure. Let me take a look here. It's possible the New King James doesn't, what does it? No, it doesn't do anything in the margin with this. But Basically, it should read like this. From the Greek, it reads like this. And whatsoever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. And whatsoever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Anyone have the New American Standard here? I thought someone did. Who does? Jim? Does it read something like that there?
Yeah, it doesn't say how, it says you shall.
Read it out loud to me if you would.
Whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven.
Oh, okay, that's not as clear as that. I thought it was a little clearer than that in the NASB. What about NIV? Someone got the NIV?
Yeah.
She's still willing to admit it after all these months. Go ahead. Go ahead, read it.
I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven.
And there's a marginal note, isn't there, a footnote? Will have been bound in heaven, will have been loosed in heaven. That's what I was saying. That's what it is in the Greek. For some reason, translators have missed it fairly consistently in most of the translations. But consulting the Greek, do you have a better translation there?
Well, no, I'm pretty sure that my Google
it's in the margin. What is your version? New King James? Okay, for some reason my edition doesn't have that there, but that's what it should say. Okay. Now, that being the case, I mean, this is no trifle. This is no minor difference. In fact, it changes the entire sense of the statement. If Jesus said, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, or whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven, it would be as if Jesus was saying, you guys initiate, and heaven will follow whatever you say. Isn't that what it would mean? You guys decide what you want, you approve it, and heaven will endorse it. You say it's okay, then God will say it's okay because you said so. But you see, the way it should read is that heaven, that is the authority of God, has already decreed certain things to be true, and the apostles will simply be the ones binding and loosing on earth the things that have already been bound and loosed by God. In other words, the role of the apostles will not be to initiate new ideas and conventions, but that they are authorized to enforce those things that God has Himself determined. They will, because they've been taught under Christ, because they have special revelation from the Spirit and so forth, they will be in the position to declare to the church what things God has approved and what things God has not approved. Whatever God has already bound or loosed in heaven, they will bind and loose on earth. That is, they will act on the earthly level as the enforcers of what God has already enacted in heaven. So essentially, when the apostles would say, I decree that so-and-so should be done, the idea is that they do so because they're in touch with God, and they know what God has decreed, so they're the official spokespersons about such things. Having the keys to the kingdom would simply mean they've been given the authority to bind and loose, or to allow and disallow certain behaviors in the church and doctrines in the church. But they would not be able to innovate their own ideas about such things. They were to simply enforce what God had already established or decreed on the subjects on which they spoke. Now, does this apply at all to the area of binding and loosing demons? Well, I don't know anyone who's ever wanted to loose any demons, but as far as binding goes, it may have I would say it may have some relevance by way of extrapolation. In other words, it is not the case that in these passages Jesus is thinking about our dealing with demons as a principal focus of these passages. He'd be saying that the church, or the apostles at least, and possibly the church as a whole, would be in the position to enforce on earth whatever things God has already established as the case in heaven. Now, we know from what the Scripture says in a number of places that Satan has been bound as far as heaven is concerned. Satan has been stripped of his authority as far as heaven is concerned. It would be then for the church to enforce on earth this reality by going about and taking from Satan his realm, basically. Going and taking those people who are subject to him and bringing them instead under subjection to Christ. Which is no doubt what Paul had in mind when he said, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Our weapons are there to bring everybody's thoughts into obedience to their Lord, not into the obedience of Satan, whom unbelievers currently follow. Now, that would simply be an extension of the principle. It would be a far cry from accuracy to say that Jesus is here intending to speak on the subject of spiritual warfare. But what he says by way of axiom. It's sort of like a truism. Whatever God has ordained in heaven, you guys do it on earth. And since we know from other passages that one of the things that has gone on in heaven is the stripping of Satan's authority and the binding, as it were, of Satan. This is a figure of speech, but that what our activities on earth basically function to establish on earth the reality that's already in heaven. Satan is stripped of authority on heaven. We take from him his realm and his authority on earth. And that could be called binding him, I suppose, but not in the sense that we often think of that in charismatic sermons on the subject. I would say in regard to this, before I go further, maybe, Jaylen, you can... Well, is this authority for every Christian? This is a very difficult question to answer, because, and I don't want to say no, but I would say that it's hard to establish whether he would apply it to all Christians or not, because he made the statements in private conference with his disciples. In one case at Caesarea Philippi, where no one was with him except the apostles, and the other case was when he and the apostles were in a house together, although we don't know exactly how private it was. There's no evidence that there was a crowd. So it's hard to say. What I would say, however, is this, that the apostles were distinct in terms of their authority over the church, but they were not distinct in terms of their general mission. The general mission of the church is that which the apostles were on the vanguard and the leadership of. As a part of the church, I think it can be said that the church, under the apostles' authority, was in the business of binding on earth what was bound in heaven, and loosing on earth what was loosed in heaven. It certainly, at least it would go along well with my own perception of what it means for Satan to be bound. I believe it is the case that when Christians go forward in missions and in intercessory prayer and evangelize and bring people to Christ and tear down the strongholds of the enemy, that they are enforcing on earth a reality that is true in heaven. In a sense, they're binding on earth what's bound in heaven. But since the apostles are long dead and yet the church is still involved in the same mission, I would have to say that the authority must rest in the church corporately, or would seem to. Though it may not rest in the same measure in every individual. There was a time when I thought that everything in the Bible that Jesus said to the apostles was for every Christian. I've mentioned this to you before. I no longer think that is true. I don't think that's a responsible way to understand some of the things that Jesus said to them. For instance, when he said, you're going to sit on 12 thrones, I don't think I'm going to sit on one of those 12 thrones, even though I'm a Christian. That was specifically to the 12 apostles. But when there are other things like that speak to them of their particular privilege and calling and authority, which do not apply generally. However, I would say this. I would say anybody who's called to do work like that which the apostles were called to do can probably count on Christ's backing them up, even as he backed up the apostles in the work. That is to say, if I'm called to be a laborer and work at McDonald's and just support missionaries or something, or I'm not going to be able to support very many working at McDonald's. Let's say I was going to work at IBM or Hewlett-Packard or something and make some money and live modestly and give to missions, and that would be my principal ministry. I might not be vested with particular power and authority over demons, since that's not my calling. But if I were called to be a missionary and to go out and confront the powers of darkness, or even a domestic evangelist in this, in my own hometown, to go out and confront the powers of darkness head on a regular basis, I would have to count on the promises Jesus gave to the apostles, who also had to do that. Being true to anybody else that Jesus calls to similar ministry. Now, I don't personally hold to the view that there are apostles today with the exact authority the apostles had over the church, but I do believe there are certainly people today who are called to ministries that are somewhat analogous to what the apostles did. Missionaries and certain leaders of ministries often are in the position to have to conduct the same kind of ministry that the apostles were engaged in, and I have no doubt. I mean, I'll tell you this, if I were called to be a missionary, I just go on the assumption that the promises God gave the apostles when they had to do this kind of thing are mine too, if I have to do the same kind of thing, that Christ doesn't send us out without the right equipment. But so I would say that the promises do rest upon the church corporately, and specifically on the apostles as the leaders. But in any generation, the leaders of the church, or those who are engaged in the kind of ministry that Christ called the apostles to, could probably count on, I would say can count on, the promises that Jesus made to the apostles, applying at least insofar as they're relevant to their modern callings. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then verse 19, that was sort of before the idea that it's specifically the apostles who found the church, and then later in the New Testament, how the church was built on the foundation of God.
Right. Uh-huh. And yeah, there definitely is a particular specialness about what he says to the apostles. The degree to which its provisions apply to other Christians besides them, I would just say many of the things Jesus gave as blanket, authorizations to the apostles don't apply in a blanket fashion to all Christians in all times in various circumstances that are different than the apostles. But I would say that in any case where persons are doing the work of apostles today, whether we call them apostles or not, that they can count on the same kind of support from Christ and the same kind of they can walk in faith that as Christ set the apostles out with these promises, that they can go out with the same promises. When I was in the ministry, I mentioned I made no distinction between the promises made to the apostles and their application to the church in general. But one of the reasons I didn't is because I also hadn't really thought through what the distinctives are of the apostles' ministry vis-a-vis that of the average Christian. I was, in my opinion, the average Christian. I was just Joe layman. I mean, I was not a clergyman. I wasn't a pastor. I wasn't ordained. Eventually, years later, I was ordained. But I mean, for most of the years of my ministry in the early days, I wasn't ordained. Had no interest in being ordained. I was just, in my thinking, I was viewing myself as the average Christian. And therefore, I thought that what I did was what basically all Christians ought to be doing, and that I noticed there were a lot of similarities between what I was doing and the kind of thing that Jesus told the apostles to do. Now, I in no sense have ever dreamed that I'm an apostle, because I don't even know that I don't think there are apostles in that sense today. But I will say this: I always just counted on these promises Jesus made to them as being true to me. Whenever I faced a demon-possessed person or had to travel by faith or whatever, I just kind of counted on it. I didn't make any distinction. But and by the way, I was never disappointed. I never found God to be unfaithful when I counted on Him in these things. So my thought is that anybody who's in a missionary enterprise or spiritual leadership thing that has any overlap with the kind of thing the apostles were called to do, that in the areas of that overlap, they can also anticipate God's faithfulness to keep the promises that are pertinent to that particular thing. Anyway, that is a good question. It's a question every Christian should ask. It's not the easiest to answer, but is this to the apostles only or to all Christians? But I would say particularly to the apostles, and in some extended sense probably to other Christians who find themselves in any parallel situation in the will of God. Well then, what I'm suggesting here is that Peter was not given a special priority over the other apostles, but the apostles themselves were addressed as having priority in the church and given special authority, symbolically referred to as the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And those keys were involved in their having the right, just as Eliakim had the right to open the doors of the king's house or to close them. So the keys given to the apostles symbolize the right to bind or to loose, to make the official dictums of the church, and to not have to be challenged by every disagreeable subordinate on the subject. If the apostles decided, that was settled. Okay, now after making these comments, we spent our entire, more than an hour now talking just about those verses today, and there was a good portion spent yesterday on it too, or last time too. We need to move along. After making these promises to the apostles, he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. Now, this, of course, was a temporary restriction. Later on, he wanted them to go tell everyone in the world that he was Jesus the Christ after his resurrection. At this point, however, I think he didn't want them stirring up fleshly zeal and excitement. There had already been several close calls where people's own messianic fervor had almost led them in a fleshly response to take him forcibly against his will and make him king. And he would just assume that everybody became aware of his being Christ at this point the same way Peter did. How did Peter know? Because the Father revealed it to him. Instead of getting people all mixed up with their own ideas of what the Messiah was and telling them, hey, this Jesus is the Messiah, with all the corresponding misunderstandings that would go with that, you better just let the Father reveal that to people, just like he had to Peter. And at this point, later on, when Jesus was gone and there'd be no danger of people making an earthly king out of him, then the apostles could be more bold about it. They'd have more clarity on it themselves, what that meant to be a Messiah and to be the Messiah. And then, they could, of course, proclaim and must proclaim Jesus to be the Christ. However, at this point in time, he didn't want them to go out and advertise this. Verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised again the third day. This is the first time of 3 times that we read of Jesus saying essentially this very thing to them. 3 times between now and the cross, he tells them very plainly that he's going to be arrested, killed, and rise on the third day. The astonishing thing is that the apostles didn't remember this or put stock in it after they actually saw Jesus crucified. They, in no sense, were expectant of his resurrection. And even when told of it, they doubted it. Which means that they must have just been kind of dull. In fact, we can see that they were dull, in a sense. Because in verse... Well, not here, I guess. It wasn't here. It was another place. After he told them about this very thing, they debated among themselves what he meant by being raised from the dead. They didn't even understand him literally there. Now, Peter took Jesus aside, verse 22, and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men." Now, Peter rebuked Jesus when Jesus said he was going to die and rise again. Now, apparently, the apostles didn't quite catch the rise again part. It's obvious that the idea of dying is the thing that Peter, caught on and got stuck with and didn't like and objected to. If he understood that Jesus was going to rise again, then he would probably have less vehemence. But it must be that Peter felt that Jesus was just indulging a little bit of melancholy pessimism. After all, a great multitude had vanished overnight. 5,000 that had been fed had just dwindled down to almost nothing, and Jesus was now leading a much less popular campaign. It seems like the peak of his popularity was now in the past, and it was going down somewhat, maybe quickly, and Peter felt like maybe this is just getting to Jesus. Maybe Jesus is getting a little discouraged, and he needs to realize that we really are on his side. After all, I remember when the 5,000 left, he even asked us if we were going to depart too. That Jesus has been getting a little bit too moody, a little melancholy. We need to affirm to him that all is not lost. There's still hope for the mission. And now Jesus is talking about dying. This guy is really indulging in some pessimism right now. And so Peter wanted to, be positive confession kind of a guy, and said, "Lord, don't speak that negative confession like that. Far be it from you. This won't happen to you." Peter's making the positive confession, you see, and he thought Jesus was making a negative confession. Actually, Jesus was making what I guess could be called a negative confession, if being arrested and dying is negative. However, in the purposes of God, it was not a negative thing. It was what God wanted, therefore it's positive. Which is what is so wrong with the positive confession thing, is because to admit that you're sick or to admit that you're low on finances is seen as, a negative confession. As if there's nothing positive that can be said about being sick or being low on finances. As if suffering has no upside. And suffering is just a bad thing that shouldn't be tolerated. I mean, the people who are this way, who have this opinion, it's just as Jesus said, you are mindful not of the things of God, but of the things of man. It's man that is concerned about financial prosperity. It's man that's concerned about his physical comfort and health. Those are not God's principal concerns. If they were, then Jesus should have been the wealthiest and healthiest and the most long-lived man that ever walked. But the fact is, for a man to die young, to live poor and die young, like Jesus did, was maybe not what the apostles thought was a great deal. But then they savored the things of man, not the things of God. In the plan of God, nothing could be better but for Jesus to have his life cut off early. And what man calls a tragedy, what man calls undesirable, what man hates and avoids at all costs may be the thing that God sees as the very best thing possible. Remember, it says, Jesus said in, I believe it's in Luke 16, I think it's verse 15. I'll just check that on that before I give you that. In Luke 16 and verse 15, at the end of that verse, Jesus said, "For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God." Now, you can see then why it'd be so tragic for a Christian to fall into being mindful of the things of man and not the things of God. The things that man values are the opposite of what God values. The things that man highly esteems are the things that God least esteems and even negatively esteems. They're an abomination to him. And for a disciple of Jesus Christ to fall into the trap of judging on the basis of human values rather than God's was a great disaster. In fact, it called forth probably the strongest rebuke Jesus gave to anyone in all his ministry. On many occasions, he rebuked the scribes and Pharisees for their hypocrisy in words that must have been scathing and stinging. In fact, when you read his rebukes to the scribes and Pharisees, if you can really picture yourself as there at the time, you can realize how uncomfortable it would have been even just to be there, just because you'd be so embarrassed for them being so raked over the coals like that in public. And yet, what Jesus said to them doesn't hold a candle to the rebuke he gave Peter. He called him Satan. At least the scribes and Pharisees were just called hypocrites. But he called Peter Satan. Get behind me, Satan. Now, does this mean that Peter was demon-possessed? No, I think not. Does it mean that he was speaking for Satan? Possibly. If it does mean he was speaking for Satan, or that Satan was speaking through Peter, there is a slight difficulty. And that would be simply that the content of what Peter is saying would seem to be discouraging the cross. Now, why would that be a problem to see it that way? Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul indicates that the secret wisdom of God manifested in the cross was something the rulers of this world did not understand. It says if they had, they would have crucified the Lord of glory. I'm talking about 1 Corinthians 2. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 7 and following. But we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age knew, for had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Now it sounds like if Satan, or the rulers of this world, and most would understand this to mean the demonic rulers, if they had understood God's strategy, they would have never cooperated. If they had understood how much damage the cross was going to do to them, they would never have gone through with crucifying Christ. Okay? And the fact that they did crucify Christ suggests that they didn't have a clue that this crucifixion was going to be so damaging to them. Now, if that's the case, if Satan and the demons didn't have a clue that the crucifixion was going to turn out for their doom, then why would Satan wish to dissuade Christ from going to the cross? If Satan is speaking through Peter saying, don't go to the cross, don't go to the cross, then that would suggest that Satan knew that the cross was going to be a bummer for him, and he wanted to prevent it. Now, my thought is, we have to assume, not only on the basis of 1 Corinthians 2, but on other considerations, that Satan did not know that the cross was going to be a victory for Christ and a defeat for Satan. I believe Satan could not have known that. And the reason is because Satan played an active role in the crucifixion. We're told specifically that Satan filled Judas's heart to go and turn him in. In the 13th or 12th chapter, I think, of John, it says that after Jesus rebuked Judas, because Judas had complained about the lady who poured perfume over Jesus' head, it says, then Satan filled Judas's heart. And he went, and betrayed Jesus. Now, Judas's turning Christ over to his crucifiers was by Satan's instigation. And although we're not told it specifically, I think we can assume that all of the murderous actions of the Sanhedrin and of the Romans and all the injustices done were certainly inspired by the devil. Certainly not, they're not the kind of thing the devil objects to, generally speaking, and the devil seems to have been pushing for this. Which means the devil didn't know that the cross was going to be a disaster for the devil. The devil was in favor of the cross up to the point before Jesus rose up again from the dead. Now, if the devil favored the cross and didn't see it as a problem to himself, why would the devil inspire Peter to try to persuade Jesus not to go to the cross? This is a hard question to answer. It's possible that when Jesus calls Peter Satan, he doesn't mean to identify Peter with the person that we call Satan, who is the spirit that works in the children of disobedience. The word Satan itself, actually in the Old Testament, was not a proper name at all. It is a Hebrew word. Satan is a Hebrew word, not a Greek word. And it appears in the Old Testament a few times, but every time it appears, it is always with the definite article, the Satan. It's not translated that way in our Bibles very often. Some of the modern translations translate it that way, but
But in the Hebrew, whenever it talks about Satan, when Satan came and accused Job to God, or when Satan stood and resisted Joshua the high priest, in the Hebrew it says, the Satan, the Satan. And the name Satan, the word Satan in Hebrew means adversary. So that actually, it is possible in those passages in the Old Testament that talk about Satan to simply translate the adversary, because Satan means adversary. Now, Satan actually takes on the force of an actual proper name in the New Testament. The New Testament is written in Greek, but it maintains this Hebrew word as a name for the devil, Satan. And that being so, we know that Satan is a personal being and not just a generic adversary. However, it's possible that Jesus was saying to Peter, you are acting the part of an adversary to me. You're like a Satan to me. Not that Satan, the actual devil himself, was putting the words into Peter's mouth, though that could be the case, but it's hard to know why Satan would do so. But that Peter himself was playing the role of a Satan, that is, an adversary to Jesus. Whereas Peter was thinking that he was playing the role of a loyal supporter, he was in fact being adversarial. He was in fact working against Christ. And that could be essentially how this is meant when Jesus calls him Satan. Basically, he's just calling him adversary. Although it's perhaps hard to explain why he'd use the Hebrew word Satan instead of us finding here the Greek word for it. But then, Jesus and his disciples did speak Aramaic, and while most of their words are translated into Greek in the Gospels, some of them are not. Some are left in the Hebrew or the Aramaic. In a few cases, this may be one of those, I don't know. In any case, it creates a few problems, and it is either the case that Satan is speaking through Peter, and that's what Jesus is acknowledging by saying, "Get behind me, Satan," or else he's simply saying, Peter, you are an adversary to me. You are saying that you are as much in opposition to the purpose of God as Satan is in making this kind of statement. Now, Satan might not, at that point in time, be opposed to the cross, but he was certainly opposed to God and Christ. And he could be saying, you too, Peter, are like a Satan, an adversary to me. And I find it interesting that he doesn't say, because you are mindful of the things of the devil and not the things of God. He says you're mindful of the things of man and not the things of God. He doesn't say, you are inspired by the devil and your thoughts are demonic and your tastes and your concerns are those of the devil himself. He says your tastes and your concerns and your mind is on things that are human. You're seeing things from a human perspective, and that in itself is adversarial to the kingdom of God, because the things of God and the things of man are separate. Man always would avoid the cross. Any of us would, if we had the choice, avoid dying at the cross or any other painful way. Or any of us would desire for our friends to escape such a fate, or our loved ones to escape such a fate. Peter's reaction to the news that Jesus would die is natural enough. Any friend would wish that his dear friend would not die, but that's just the problem. It was natural. It was failing to see God's plan and God's concerns. It was reacting as natural men do, rather than perceiving the higher good in this seemingly negative situation. And this is the case. We could speak of the cross by extension, the cross in the life of the believer, as any negative thing that is incurred in the Christian life, any unpleasant and suffering thing that is incurred by the believer as a result of his loyalty to Christ. Christ went to the cross because he would not violate the will of his Father. He said, Father, if it's your will, let this cup pass from me, if it's possible, but not my will, but yours be done. If Jesus had not surrendered his will to the Father, he could have avoided the cross. The reason he went to the cross is because he wouldn't put his will above that of the Father. Your cross is the point at which your will crosses God's will. And if you surrender to the will of God, any special suffering that comes to you as the result of that surrender could, in a sense, be, by extension, called your cross. Now, it's not your cross if you have an offensive mother-in-law. It's not your cross if you marry, somebody who's hard to live with, or something like that. That's not the cross that you have to bear. But any suffering that comes upon you because of your refusal to compromise, because you insist on doing the will of God rather than your own will, and you incur thereby pain or suffering, that can be your cross. Well, humans don't like crosses. But God knows that crosses are good for people. Jesus said you need to take up your cross daily to follow me. It's good for the purpose of God for us to bear a cross. Now, is sickness a cross? Not necessarily always, but it can be. When Paul had his thorn in the flesh, whatever that might have been, he prayed 3 times that it would go away. He obviously didn't see it as a cross he had to bear. He wanted to get rid of it. Most sicknesses probably can be viewed that way. It's something that God wants us eventually to get over. Maybe He wants to heal us right now of it. That's perhaps a safe assumption in most cases. But when God specifically said to him, well, no, I'll give you grace. It's good for you to be weakened by this thing. My strength is made perfect in your weakness. Then Paul had the choice. Is he going to surrender his will to God's will and resign himself to it? Or is he going to, resist this and be bitter and angry at God, or what? Well, obviously he decided to resign himself to the will of God and say, okay, my will is to have this thorn removed, but God's will is for me to have it. Therefore, I'll embrace it. I'll accept it. And forever afterwards, his suffering of that thorn was, in a sense, a cross that was his because of his surrender to the will of God and because of God's work in his life. Sickness can be that way. I'm not saying that all sickness is. But it certainly cannot be said that all sickness is outside the will of God, because God may have a good purpose in it. And Paul said of his thorn 3 times, he said this happened so that he might not be exalted above measure. That obviously is God's concern, that Paul should not be exalted above measure. And therefore the thorn of the flesh was given to prevent that from happening. Okay, then Jesus goes on. Verse 24, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each one according to his works. Assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. We talked a lot about verse 28. I have a feeling we won't talk too much about it. I won't take too much time on it now because we've talked about the various ways that can be understood. It'll perhaps be worth mentioning again when we talk about the Transfiguration in our next session. But let's talk about especially verses 24 through 27. Now, Jesus had just said in verse 21 that he was going to die and rise again. Peter objected to the death motif of Jesus' teaching, and he said, no, this is certainly not a good thing. And Jesus now turns to all the disciples, including Peter, and says, well, it looks like we need to readjust our thinking here a little bit. You resist the idea of a cross. You resist the idea of suffering. You resist the idea of death. Well, let me reorientate you a little bit here. If anyone's going to follow me, he's got to accept a cross. He's got to accept death. If he seeks to save his life, he'll lose it. But if he will lose his life for my sake, he'll find it forever. And so Jesus is basically trying to turn around their wrong perception and perspective on this and say, listen, don't you know that to follow me is going to cost you your life? And that shouldn't be considered so unique, because whatever a person pursues is going to cost them their life. No one's getting out of here alive. Everyone's going to die one way or another. Some people will die for their drinking habit. Some will die for their homosexual life choices. They'll get AIDS and die for that. Some people will die for their choice of a violent life and gang, involvement or whatever. I mean, people die for causes all the time. And some people just die in the pursuit of the only thing that matters to them, and that's survival. Just trying to survive, but eventually age catches up and everyone dies eventually. To die for Jesus is no tragedy at all. In fact, the only time death is not a tragedy is when you die in the will of God. The greatest tragedy that can come to a person would be that they die outside the will of God, or even live apart from the will of God. If God wants you to die and you somehow manage to live, then you have not done yourself a favor or the purposes of God a favor. If you seek to save your life. Now, by the way, what does he mean by seeking to save your life? Does it mean that it's wrong for you, for instance, to look both ways before you cross the street? Or that it's wrong for you to get an operation if you have a cancerous growth and it can be removed? If you do that, you're trying to save your life. Is that a bad deal? What about eating? Don't you eat in order to save your life? Is that wrong? Obviously not. His statement has to be taken in its proper setting. What he means by that is, of course, if you seek by compromising your obedience to God to save your life. That is to say, if your life is on the line, and the only way to save it would be by compromising what you're supposed to do and not doing the right thing, then it's better for you to lose your life by not compromising, because then you'll find it for eternal life, than to preserve your life by compromise, because then you lose something which is more eternal, something of greater value. So, of course, he means by this, it's if you lose your life because you will not compromise your convictions, that's great. You'll find it unto life eternal. But if you save your life by compromising your convictions, then you'll lose something even more valuable, and that is your soul. What will a man give in exchange for his soul? In Hebrews chapter 11, where it talks about a number of persons in the Old Testament who were tortured and died and imprisoned and so forth, it says in verse 35, in Hebrews 11:35, it says, "And others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection." They were tortured not accepting deliverance. What does it mean they were not accepting deliverance? Is it that someone said, "Listen, we want to let you go"? And say, No, torture me again, please. That's not what's being suggested here. Everyone I know in the Bible who was being tortured and were given their freedom took it. But not accepting deliverance in this case means they would not accept relief on the terms that it was available to them. In the cases he's talking about prophets who were killed for not compromising their word. Later, the apostles would face the same kind of thing. They'd die because they would not compromise. Now, they could have delivered themselves by compromise. If Jeremiah had said, "Okay, I'm sorry, I won't preach anymore these words," he would have lived out a natural lifetime. But that was too costly. That was deliverance at too great a cost. To save his life through disobeying God wasn't worth it. And therefore he refused deliverance, as did Isaiah and other prophets in the Old Testament, and Jesus himself and the apostles too. They refused deliverance from their torments because the terms of deliverance would be that they must compromise their convictions, and they simply wouldn't pay that price. They would not compromise. And therefore, by their obstinance, by their stubbornness, by their insisting that they would obey God rather than man and seek God's pleasure rather than their own, they refused by that choice deliverance that would have been theirs had they compromised and renounced what they believed. Well, to seek to save your life by compromise is not good. You'll lose it doing that. And when he says, "What is a man profited if he loses his own soul and gains the whole world? And what will he give in exchange for his soul?" I mean, this question is rhetorical. There's no answer to it. A man won't give anything in exchange for his life. The word soul can be translated life, and it is in some translations. But to gain the whole world and lose your soul, you haven't profited at all. And this because of the relative difference between that which is temporal and that which is eternal, of course. Now, when Jesus said, and I didn't comment specifically on this in verse 24, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Maybe I should make a few comments on that, and then we have to close. Deny himself should not be necessarily equated with what we nowadays commonly call self-denial. Although it sounds like the same thing, the term self-denial today usually means something like fasting or asceticism. Just refusing legitimate enjoyments for religious purposes. People who sleep on a bed of nails or go on long fasts or refuse comforts unnecessarily. They are practicing what would often be called self-denial. But that's not what it means to deny yourself. Because persons can be practicing this what we call self-denial and still be very self-centered in the whole thing. They can be doing it as a mask for pride. In fact, Paul says that himself in Colossians chapter 2. I'm aware that we should have quit a few moments ago.